Hello. Hi, everybody. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Where I
Hello,
am,
hello.
it would be good afternoon, but I know we have people from all over the world because I'm looking at the comments. Let's see. We've got Seattle and Rhode Island and Toronto, Canada and Columbia, Missouri and South Carolina and Somerset, UK and Las Vegas, Nevada and Hawaii and Hot Springs, Arkansas and South Africa and Florida and I'm almost done. Sandpoint, Idaho and Toronto, Canada. Like, just move along. But yes, as you can tell, from all over. So thank you for joining us. The mountains of Tennessee. Oh, I love that area. It's one of my favorites. San Diego. I love it. Nice diverse crowd, which is great because we're gonna be talking about some things that it'll be helpful to have the wisdom of the crowds because we're going to be talking about mistakes that editors typically catch. And while we can all agree on the mistakes, how you address the mistakes, they're a little bit personal. And so I think even Gareth and I are going to disagree. And certainly I'm going to be interested to know how you handle these issues as well. So
Yeah,
yes,
there's nothing more fun than editorial disagreements. So we'll
exactly.
see what everybody comes up with. So there are a few here, prefacing everything as we normally do. Between this list and last week's list, we kind of formulated these based on conversations with editors that we know and our own work. Sort of behind the scenes here. So we kind of compiled some of the things that pop up most often, and as we go, you can kind of figure out if you see them a lot yourself if you're watching, and whether you do them yourself if you're watching
Ooh,
as well. So feel free to call yourself out in the comments if you like and say, yeah, guilty, because
yep.
it's the first step is acknowledging the problem.
That's right. And it's one of those things. The reason why these are top 5 mistakes is because we do see them a lot. So don't assume that you don't make them. And one thing I am going to show, because we're going to go through some examples of these problems, is that while the examples are very obvious, because I'm trying to highlight the problem, we'll be talking about how they can subtly sneak in there. They're not always quite as obvious as some of these examples would make it out to be. So you've got to be careful. And if the shoe fits, wear it. So before we get started, though, I'm just curious where we're at before any of this in terms of what we think some of the, let me move my mic a little bit, what we think some of these big mistakes might be. What do you think are some of the mistakes that we've heard from editors that we've discovered ourselves working as editors and book coaches and things like that? Bob's already saying he's guilty, guilty, guilty. Well, I've read your book, Bob, and I can tell you, you did not make at least one of these. No, I'm just kidding. You're good, Bob. I like Bob. So yeah, but what are some of the mistakes that either you think you make that you caught yourself, or you think a lot of other people make? I am just curious.
And it
Well,
may be, I believe, some of this as well. There's a little bit of a mix that you might come across here, that because they're not always sort of line editing issues. One thing
no,
that we do want to
that's
get to, and
right.
we will get to later, is that a good editor will also help you structurally and in terms of craft, not just grammatical problems. I see, mentioned in the comments there, Bruce. Yeah, comma splicing. That we did cover that last week, so it's not making a reappearance. But I
We
think
did.
if I had my way, it would be appearing in every single stream to tell everybody to stop it.
I feel like Gareth has like a big poster that's like "Friends don't let friends comma splice," and he just has it all over his house. He wakes up just like no comma splicing. Yeah, so we're seeing different comments, changing tenses, adverbs, POV head hopping, inconsistent storyline, boring pace, switching POV or time in random moments. I'll have to say, some of you are on the right track with some of these. So we have a smart audience, that is for sure. But I always knew that. But let's go ahead and get started because these are the mistakes that when people point them out, you're like, ah. And what we're trying to do with this video and with our presentations is to really get you to the point where when you show your work to an editor, because more than likely you will. Editors are very helpful to have, no matter how much you listen to us, how much you listen to the AutoCrit software. Generally speaking, you still want to give your work over to a professional. But what you don't want is for the professional to get hung up on things that you could have easily solved yourself. You want them to focus on the deeper issues and really be able to help you fine tune your craft versus handling these big mistakes. So let's talk about these big mistakes, shall we? What's number one? POV or tense shifting. Yes, this is very, very common. I can tell you, as somebody who reads a lot of work that we get submitted through AutoCrit for inspection, for our short story contests, or just out and about, this is something that happens a lot. Let's look. Like, she stopped, the wind blowing in her hair, her heart thumped in her chest. I feel weak. Yeah, no, this is awful. Of course, this is awful on so many levels, but like when you automatically go from third person and it's past and then it's present and it's just terrible. Like that's where if you end up with something like this that is as fundamentally broken as something like this example, often an editor is just going to say, I don't even know what to do for you. You've got to address this first, because otherwise your whole thing's going to be redlined with, okay, you're in this person POV, you're in this person POV, you're in this tense, you're in that tense. And I just don't have time for that. And it's not going to benefit you either, because I'm going to be so focused on that, I'm going to miss the story altogether. What do you think, Gareth? POV tense shifting.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a fair thing to say as well. Is one of these things that sometimes, thankfully, I don't think I've ever really dealt with anything like that. But it can happen, and I have heard from some other editors that have faced it, that somebody has come to them with a manuscript, and within the first couple of chapters, it's just like I cannot deal with this. The fundamentals of the writing are so broken that it's simply not going to be valuable time. Spent trying to fix every single little thing, and don't be disheartened. I would say is one thing when that happens. It simply means that your kind of basic skill with grammar and writing isn't sort of at the point where you want to be aiming for a book, and just fix that. Spend more time researching, look into it, practice, especially practice. But if you are really, really stuck, and you can't get your head around it, but you really want to tell this story, of course, there's services like ghostwriters, and people that who can write, can sit with you if you enlist them for help, and they can write the book while you dictate to them, kind of tell them where you want the story to go and the images that you want them to paint, and they'll do it. You can always have someone else along with you, but it's not the end of the world if an editor does get their hands on it and say, look, hey, you need to make this writing better on a fundamental level. Now, that's not to say that anything that you see is as bad as this example, because that's particularly awful.
Yes.
But yeah, point of view and tense shifting, quite common. I would say that more often than not, tense shifting is a very common curse that many writers come across. It just sometimes naturally happens in first drafts and then escapes, manages to evade you all the way through to the end. So your editor's like, you tense shifted here. And I think no matter how much effort you put in pulling your hair out, you'll probably end up with an editor saying, you tense shifted here. It's like,
I just love this person. Please fix the example. It's like when you're a writer, you're like, I can't look at it anymore. But I will say, as much as this is blatantly obvious, especially with that last sentence, the first three is something I see a little bit more often, especially with something like the wind blowing in her hair or something, where you all of a sudden it goes to present, because it's just like they're in the moment so much that they just start writing that way and then they forget about it. And then also I find sometimes stylistically you will throw in certain tense shifting and you can get away with it, but that's just something to be very careful with. But in terms of dealing with an editor and them saying it's just fundamentally broken, I kind of look at it from a baking standpoint. And you could be an absolute brilliant cake decorator, but if your cake is not fundamentally sound, doesn't really matter, right? And so that doesn't take away from the fact that you could be a really gifted artist in other ways, and you can work on getting those mechanical structural things in place. So you don't have to beat yourself up for that, but if somebody gives you that feedback, take it. And what I often find is people who get that feedback are able to fix it pretty well once they're aware of the problem. All right, let's look at another example. I didn't know what to do next. Should I go west or east? I choose to go left. Now, this is where it's weird, right? Because this is a tense shifting, but could somebody get away with something like this? What do you think, Gareth?
I don't think I would let that slide
Yeah,
particularly.
exactly. Yeah, right.
The one example that came to my mind while you were speaking, kind of based on the previous example in a way, was you could have an accidental tense shift where you had a character is looking at something or thinking about something, and then the next line you use is "It's always this way." If you're writing in past tense and then you say "It's always this way," however, that can be fixed by italicizing that part. It's always this way. He thought. Well, then you fix that tense shift. It's no longer a tense shift. It is an immediate thought.
Right.
So you can have italicization. It's a fun word to say.
Right. So, for example,
To fix
for
it.
this one, let me just go ahead and fix it. You could do something like, I didn't know what to do next. Should I go west or east? Italicize, I chose to go west, right? Something more like that. At least we're getting on the right track, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And David in the comments on Leslie said, "I choose to go left." Simpsons reference, everybody.
I love it. All right. What about Charles looked at him, pulling his hand into a fist. His stomach lurched. John stared back. A chill caused the hairs on John's neck to stand on end. This is maybe even more common because this is not as blatant in some ways. What we're having is the reader is able to see things that Charles should only be able to see and John should only be able to know about at the same time. Unless you're deliberately writing third person omniscient, because if we're doing a limited on Charles, then why does Charles know that the necks on the hairs on John's neck are stirring? If we're doing a third person limited on John, then how would we know that Charles's stomach lurch? So this is head hopping. I would say this is more common than the egregious examples I just gave, because you just forget for a moment that, hey, wait, the person that I'm in the POV of shouldn't know that. That's not possible.
Yeah, it can be the head hopping issue can be quite insidious. It's more easy to catch when you are writing in limited, because of course omniscient is another beast, and it opens up things in
Just
different
don't do
ways.
it. I'm sorry.
It's like, yeah,
that's like my thing with Gareth with comma slicing. I'm like omniscient.
it's like just stay away from it.
Yeah, it's like Dune did it the best, and just leave it at that. That's cool.
No, I think omniscient works specifically for certain effects, especially in genre writing.
Yes.
But it is intentionally used at certain points. The rest is more or less limited, restricted to characters. And you can more easily find it in that regard, where if you've written 3/4 of a chapter from one character specific limited point of view, and then all of a sudden at a point in that chapter you say something that the other character thought, you've head hopped. It's more easy to catch them in that kind of setup.
Mm-hmm. And of course, people are picking on other things. This does feel like stage direction and not very good writing. And I would say you probably should have a paragraph for John, but we're just addressing one problem at a time, people. But I appreciate it. See, we have our editor's brains on. That is the right answer. And I love how sharp our audience is. Okay. What about John leans over to Derek? How are you doing? I was better yesterday, Derek says. John nods and pats Derek on the back. You got this, John says. Derek smiles and gets back to his work. There is no tense problem here. The third person present, I hate. I hate it. I think it reads awful. So this is my own little personal pet peeve. And I will say there are a lot of editors and agents that it's not going to work. First person present works. I don't know. Third person present, Gareth. Do you like it?
That's for screenplays.
Yeah. It feels like, what it reminds me of when you read this is it feels like you're watching a show with like the visual captioning on, that they use for people with visual impairment, and they're just describing all the scene in real time. It just reads a little bit unusual to me. So, but maybe this is a personal pet peeve, but it does come across as off-putting a lot, and it's not commonly done. Hard to find.
No, it is, I think, more coming down to a personal thing, because it is a combination. It is a recognized combination of something you can do. And I'm pretty sure I have read some very good stories that have been presented in that format, but it's very rare and very difficult to actually make as involving as it needs to be. You got to make the involving meter overtake the annoying meter. And that can be difficult.
And I will say too that what I often find when people write third person present is that they'll switch back and forth a lot because they aren't used to reading third person present because there's just not nearly as many works in that format. So you might just be better off doing, third person past. All right. What about repetition? Yes, repetition takes so many different forms in terms of writing. We can have things like exact repetition. She opened the door. She noticed that a set of footprints dotted the floor. She followed the footprints towards the end of the room. She hesitated for a moment. She was concerned danger was ahead. Now, here we have the repetition of every sentence starting with she. And that's really boring and dry. It's not good. The one thing that I will find, though, is that one reason why people, in my opinion, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, Gareth, is why I think a lot of writers end up in this predicament is they are so concerned about passive construction or starting with an ing verb or things like that, that they kind of paint themselves into a corner. And I'm not recommending that you fall into any of those traps because it's good to be aware of them. But on the other hand, you can't end up with this. This is a problem.
Yeah, it's something to really think about, and it does kind of stand to the testament of drafting. This is why we draft and we draft and we draft and we draft, because if you were writing a draft or going through, say, a first draft, and you are hell bent on avoiding anything passive, and you do come up with something like this, well, then it's fine. You go back on the second draft and you restructure.
Yep. Yeah. And honestly, if you're one of the, if you're doing kind of like a NaNoWriMo or a sprint or something like that, and you end up with paragraphs like this is something you fix. This is not the end of the world. It's just you don't want to end up with your manuscript like this. First draft, fine. It's okay. You're getting that stage direction out. You're getting that out. Somebody has a specific question with this, and yes, in first person, this is the thing. How do you deal with too many sentences starting with I in a memoir or deep first person? It's true. In general, I would say there tends to be a little more forgiveness for starting sentences with I in first person than I feel like pronouns in third person. However, that doesn't mean that you can do it too often. And we do have that report in AutoCrit that tells you those, initial pronoun uses, which can be really helpful because when you see that inching up, high in terms of percentages, something to look out for sure.
Yeah, say Kim as well there. Really a rule of thumb, one thing that I try to keep in mind anyway, to avoid these things, especially from first person, because it can be a real plague in first person. I know a few people who really don't like writing in first person because it's just automatic to say, I did this, I did that, I constantly. Instead of opening with a reference to thyself or the character, reference something in the setting, reference an object, reference a sound, reference something external to begin with, and chain that along from the previous sentence is usually the best.
I don't know if my internet cut out or something, or Gareth's internet cut out. Somebody's cut out.
You're still here. Could you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay.
So.
Yeah, that was it. Going back in the questions as well, there's one I just didn't want to leave running away there.
Oh,
From
sure.
the first instance, Bruce was mentioning, are we maybe dealing with the fashion of style in some of that point of view choices and whatnot? Bruce, yeah, I think there is an element of that, certainly, within the industry. And perhaps if more people did start pumping out a lot of, what was the annoyance there? Third person
present. Yeah.
And then more of those got published in better shape, so better stories were coming out in third person present, then more people start doing it, then comes back into fashion with quality approach, well, then maybe it would become more popular. So yeah, I certainly think
sure. And I mean, one obviously that almost never comes up is second person, except if you're reading a choose your own adventure book. But again, choose your own adventure books made it work for themselves. So it's not like it's never to be used ever. It just depends on the context. All right, let's look at another example of repetition. This is the type that I feel like could come up a lot. Her glistening blonde hair shimmered in the sunlight. Several chapters later, her glistening blonde hair shimmered in the sunlight. Several chapters later, and so on and so forth. Maybe not as egregious as this or quite as purple, but what you often find is an author will have a way that they like to describe something. And then every time they talk about that, they start using the same adjectives, the same phrasing, down to entire blocks. And again, this is something that AutoCrit can help you with the repetition report. Very helpful report because it can look through the whole work and find those long phrases that you may not catch. Because you certainly don't want this several chapters later, but if you have this, close together, it can really run you ragged because it makes it look like you just don't have enough imagination to talk about something in different ways, and you're just treading water. I like that. Write about her hair at nighttime. Change the context. Yeah, no, that's true. That's a way you can fix this by changing the context. I know, Gareth, you have pet peeves about this with certain authors about like how they describe certain action sequences. I think I've heard before.
Oh, I do. Yeah, a few. I think anybody who's taken our horror course along with me knows a few examples from there that I like to pull out for highlighting this. Usually with me, it's well, number one, this kind of thing, her glistening blonde hair constantly shimmering, and but also metaphor. So you've a lot of the time find an author has come up with a really what they think is a cool metaphor, what probably is a cool metaphor in the first instance, but by the sixth time the same thing has been described with that metaphor,
right,
it starts to wear thin. And the same kind of thing with a lot of even more simple description. So let's say you're writing in genre and you your creature, maybe even if it is a snake or it's a snake-like thing that slithers when it moves. Again, every single time you encounter that creature, it shouldn't slither. Find different ways to get that same feel across.
Yeah, this is something that even J.K. Rowling annoyed me with in, I think it was the fifth book, because characters were constantly getting upset and turning on their heel to leave a room. And it just started to annoy me after a while because I'm like, okay, I get it. Like they're leaving the room in a huff, but there's other ways to describe that. It felt so repetitive. But it could be that if I asked her about it, she'd be like, well, yes, it was repetitive and it was intentional because I'm trying to relate these characters together, and it was a stylistic choice that you just didn't appreciate. But I will say, to Gareth's point, you will run the risk of irritating your audience or just looking like you don't quite have enough, imaginative ways of putting it. Not to mention, you are literally sharing the same thing again, which means you're treading water, you're not developing story, character, world, any of those things. You're just repeating information. This is an example that I'm not going to read out loud. This is from an early piece of writing that I did back in the day. And what happened to me here was, well, I had this first paragraph beginning with the rock ceiling grew closer, and then the second paragraph ending with the ceiling grew closer, and they were right next to each other. And if an editor would have caught this, they would have been like, really? There's other ways you can put this. You can, you don't, it's a bit much.
I just want to call out Bruce's solution here.
At night, her blonde hair totally failed to close. And that's where repetition can be your friend, right? If it's setting up like a joke, or not even a joke, but like a non sequitur, like a surprise. If it's like, this always happens, and then this always happens, and then all of a sudden it's like, nope, it didn't. That could be actually a great use of repetition for an audience. If every time somebody enters a room, they're like, smiling, and then in the same exact way, and then one time they come in and they look devastated, well, that's obviously going to land a lot more if you set it up as they're just a regimented sort of person that is always that way. So again, like some of these things, it is somewhat stylistic, and it depends on the actual work. Somebody was specifically asking how you set it up in AutoCrit to find these. You don't have to set it up. It's a report that's already there. It's under repetition. There are different reports there. There's repeated words, which looks within a short area of your book to make sure you're not repeating too much in a short area. There's repeated phrases, which goes a little bit longer. And then you can look at whole counts of words and whole counts of phrases that look over your whole book. So just play around with those reports in the repetition category. They're your friends, that's for sure. Let's talk about inconsistent language. There's many different ways that inconsistent language can rear its ugly head. Let's look at this. Wendy always loved her job at Electrographics Corporation. Every day she worked on designs that captivated audiences. The Electrographic Corporation was responsible for some of the most impressive visual displays in modern theater. Now, this is inconsistent language, as in you just forgot your proper nouns. And I see this often. Where you set up something and then just a little bit later, it's like you forgot what you called it. This is something an editor will pick up really quick. Not the end of the world, but if your work is just littered with these all the way through, it's just, sloppy. Pay attention. Keep notes.
Yeah, I think a lot of these as well tie back into when we had our presentation with Ali Mashadi from the Writers Ally. A lot of them can end up being there in final drafts as, what was she called them? Like editing refugees or something like that. They're the kind of casualties of editing that have been left over when you've changed things but not caught it in different places. So it can be different proper nouns here, character names, things that 1 minute a character's called Shelley and the two chapters later they're Melissa because you changed it but missed it. So keep an eye out.
Yeah, keep an eye on those sort of things. Let's go a little bit further. Genesis counted 3 people entering the elevator. Hesitating, she leaned over to push the button. When she turned back, she found only 2 people. Anybody notice the inconsistency here? Yes, in one place I spelled out 3, and the other place I used a numeral. Generally speaking, the biggest thing that's your help in terms of style guide and stuff like that is to just be consistent. If you're consistent, it'll help. Now, does that mean, and people have different opinions on, what kind of style guide you find. Is it Chicago style guide, whatever it is. But like I said, the most important thing is to stay consistent, because otherwise you're going to bring attention to yourself when you do it in one way, and one way in another. And I'm sure with Gareth, you can think of that, American British spelling, you pick one, you don't mix it up because.
Yeah. I see that part of the reason for this as well is as long as you're consistent, when it hits an editor's desk and it's decided afterwards what the, this kind of final style is going to be, well, not even so much an editor's desk, but even a publisher's desk, if they're then going to turn it into house style, if you're consistent, it's easier to swap the elements to house style rather than having to hunt them down.
Right. Yep. Let's move on. The cat sat on the floor, he hissed. Slowly, he moved towards the aquarium. Inside, glissoding through the liquid, he could scrutinize the ichthyological specimens. Yeah, not as egregiously as this, but what you will find sometimes is people will shift their vocabulary to crazy town because they just are worried that their language is not interesting enough, and they'll just start throwing in all these SAT words, which it just all of a sudden throws you for a loop, especially depending on your point of view. Now, I have seen authors that the point of view changes the vocabulary, and I think that's great. To a certain extent, the character has a higher vocabulary level. Maybe they're more eloquent in how they speak, so it comes out in even the prose. But what you don't want to do is have a character that is somebody that uses very simple language all of a sudden start using highfalutin scientific language just out of the blue. And I also would say, even if you're going to do point of view shifts like that, you really have to be careful, because if you start at a certain vocabulary level and then all of a sudden people have to go from 0 to 100, it's going to throw them for a loop, and they're going to feel like you switched books on them or something to that effect. What do you think, Gareth?
Yeah, it becomes too much work. It's you kind of settle into a rhythm and a mindset as you're reading, and if it's just going from pillar to post, it's not pleasant. It's not pleasant. So even if it's involving it, you may be likely to fall off the rails there. I noticed a bit of a discussion going on about the American versus British. What my favorite is whenever I use words like burnt toast. The Americans are like, it's burned. I'm like, no, it's quite clearly burnt. But
oh, really?
We have Elizabeth
burnt
here.
Toast?
Burnt toast.
But I mean, I don't think of that as that's weird. That's how I'm used to it.
Yeah, yeah, you get different people. Some people say that
Yeah.
things like burnt, or one that I see quite often is learnt as well.
Yes,
I
learnt is
learnt it.
definitely British. Yeah.
Elizabeth, there, an editor marked my UK spelling wrong. I'd say that editor needs to take a nice big mug of English breakfast tea and calm down, because it's not really an issue.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, isn't there too like the way that you use verb agreement with like corporations is different? Because I thought like British you would say like Microsoft are doing something, whereas we would say Microsoft is doing something. I don't remember. I want to say there's something to that effect. The grammar fans out there can tell me. I thought there was something to that effect, but all right, let's talk about pacing problems. Again, this comes in many different ways. For example, the sun rose over the mountains. Jamal stirred, forcing himself out of bed. He walked to his bathroom and brushed his teeth. Typical morning routine. A little deodorant and a smile in the mirror, and he was ready for work. Yeah, if your pacing means that you are describing every little thing going in somebody's life and it's taking a very long time for your story to actually go anywhere, well, this is something an editor will catch. And this is obviously more on the developmental side, because this is not a line editing problem. This paragraph probably just doesn't even need to exist. Because why do we need to know any of this necessarily? Maybe you need to know that the person lives in the mountains. Everything else, I mean, anybody gets out of bed, brushes their teeth, puts on deodorant, and goes to work. Like, so you're really not learning anything about this character. You're just trying to get the audience into the story. And I'm sure a lot of our audience knows this already. But starting your story with the typical day, the person waking up, the person looking in the mirror. These are all cliches that early writers tend to fall into because they're just trying to find a place to start the story, and they're almost afraid to start it when it gets interesting. They feel like I don't know, like the person will be disoriented, which can happen, but I would say go more on that side than on this side in terms of fear, based on my experience.
Yeah, there's a lot that doesn't need to be said there. Quite right, I think, as Daniel says, a lot of early authors kind of feel like this is the way to move into the story, to ease into a beginning. But this isn't starting the story. This is what I like to call clearing your throat. Isn't
Really, it
necessary.
is. Yeah.
The story starts when things are not normal, so you get to that as quick as possible. That's the story, not
Mm-hmm.
what everybody does in the morning, because it doesn't need to be said. We kind of assume that the character's gotten up and freshened up and done all of the morning stuff before they've gone about their day. The only reason to really call this kind of thing out is if the character is not doing all the things that we expect in the morning. So it could be like the ninth day that they haven't brushed their teeth and they scoff at that. Well, it's telling us something about the character in
Right.
that regard. So unless it's actually necessary and odd or different, leave it out.
Yes. And I would say, I think too, if you're trying to get across that the character has a rather boring life before things got interesting, I you don't have to avoid that completely, but that literally could be like more or less a sentence, and it really probably shouldn't be your first sentence, because remember, talking about a boring life isn't kind of boring. That's the point, right? So what you really want to so you can always use that as a contrast later. So if instead of this, it's like, Jamal never expected that when he got to work, he found out that zombies had taken over his office. Well, first of all, we know that's not a normal day, right? But we can get to, at some point in the story, it not even has to be very far. It could be like, oh, I wish I was just back to my normal daily grind. I'm never going to complain about it again. And we'll get all that backstory. We don't need it up front. It can come out later.
There's an opening.
Finding
See,
the
that's when your morning isn't.
Oh, Florida. Yes. We do have that in Florida. What we also have are iguanas that will freeze in the wintertime and fall from trees and hurt people and send them to the hospital. Because we're not supposed to have iguanas. They are an invasive species and they do not like the cold. And so we literally do have real world warnings that they say, be careful when you go out into these woods, because iguanas might be frozen and they might fall on your head. And a frozen iguana on your head, it's no joke.
And this one from Stephen. This makes me think about the beginning, like it's the opening of one of these funny backwards limericks.
The sun never rose, Molly still but fell out of bed. Well, the sun never rose is an interesting question. It's like the apocalypse is upon him. He has 10 minutes to live. Okay. All right. What about something like this? The horse walked through the glen. Birds sang out melodies. The barn sat straight ahead. He trotted on tired legs. He needed to be home. It had been far too long. You might have noticed that beyond the fact that this is not a terribly fascinating paragraph, that mechanically there's something broken. And that is that all of these sentences have the exact same amount of syllables or close to it. And that just makes it feel very monotonous. And this is another way that this kind of falls into repetition as well, but it also falls into pacing. When you have sentences that are just the same rhythm over and over and over and over and over, you are putting your audience into a trance. And if an editor, hits your work and your first page are a bunch of paragraphs like this, they're going to notice it right off, and they're going to want to just start picking apart sentences, combining sentences, adjust it out. Somebody has a good advice here. They said, clap out the sentence. That's an interesting strategy. I've never thought of doing that for a whole book. I can certainly see doing that, though, for a scene in which the pacing matters. Like, what about an action sequence, right? And you're like, okay, wait, I want to feel like, I want to feel like action. You kind of need to do that, because when you read, even though you're not necessarily reading out loud, a lot of people will hear it in their head, and it'll still just hit you rhythmically, even if you're not aware of it. It's subconscious, and it's a great way to manipulate the reader subconsciously. It's such a tool that I think a lot of people don't use. What do you think, Gareth?
No, you said that. I have an image in my head now of people either spinning around or standing, reading their action sequence and pumping their arms in rhythm, like in Rocky Horror Picture Show when they're all frozen. It's like, you better not hurt her.
Yeah.
It's making me think of that. But yeah, the whole concept Daniel's talking about is correct. You don't want to induce monotony. It becomes a lullaby. Let's put it that way.
Well, Steven says, it belongs as lyrics for a 3-chord song.
Yeah, and then when it goes on and on and on, your brain just drifts away, and that's how you end up at the bottom of a page and going, oh, wait, because then your mind kicks in, because physically you tell yourself, I have to turn the page, but then you realize you haven't actually read any of it. You've just drifted on through. So it will get caught out very, very quickly by an editor, but it's worth spending the time and just looking for places like, you see a passage like this. It's easy to catch. But I mean, the same can be said for long spots as well. Anybody who's been with us for a while knows my undying love for M dashes, and I can end up using those and making sentences that are too long, strung one after another, again in a very repetitious manner, and that's not fun to read either. You want to mix it up. Make music.
Yep. Larry has good advice. A verbal computer read back may reveal some of this. Yes, and that's something that the AutoCrit software does as well. There's that little, it looks like a little a speaker kind of icon, like a sound volume, and it's a text reader. And if you highlight your text, you can have it read with a voice. And it's a mechanical voice, but it does sound pretty natural. But what it really helps you with is the rhythm and just the sound of it. Because there's so much to that, and we're not going to talk about today, but even just using sound devices and things like that could be really helpful. But certainly be careful of repetition in your rhythm. Somebody does not like that the barn is a person sitting down. Yeah. I didn't say these examples were good. But another thing within AutoCrit is it does have the sentence length variation report, and this really helps you look at, again, if you have a bunch of sentences in a row that are just kind of hovering there, well, that means you're in this trance, right? You're just, you do want up and down. And the same thing with your paragraph length. Paragraphs with that white space, it can often be such a subconscious thing that it can help the reader see emphasis in certain points and pacing, and directs their attention and the rhythm and how they're reading it and processing. These are all very helpful tools. They're also very they're also things that somebody early on when they're not using them right, you can tell. Like I can say a lot of times when I'm editing new writers, I really want to break up their paragraphs, like big time, because they often give me these blocks of text, and I'm like, it's not helping you at all. All right, let's
I
talk
just
about.
have to
Oh,
call out
sorry.
Anna's comment as well. Short sentences, quick and pace.
Come,
Uh,
sit. Now do press up. Yes, exactly.
Drop and give me 20, Daniel.
Yes. Well, I'll give you 20 bad examples, but that's what I do. I was just looking at the comments there. Yes. So bland dialogue. Speaking of Gareth and me, no, I'm just kidding. Speaking of bland dialogue, I will say, and I don't think I'm alone in this, one of the ways that I will look and see whether or not I want to read something at all is I jump to dialogue. If it's a new author and I'm like at a bookstore, sometimes I will literally just jump to dialogue, because often authors that I just can't get through are authors that don't write dialogue in a way that I respond to, especially if it's a genre where I know it'll tend to be a little dialogue heavy, which I often actually I probably prefer, I would say, dialogue heavy books, just because I don't know, maybe because I like to talk, but I tend to like it. But I will very much gear what I read based on the author's use of dialogue, and so I often go straight to it. And I know editors do too, in terms of picking clients, figuring out if they're a client they want to work with. What do you think, Gareth? Do you tend to go to dialogue pretty early on when analyzing an author?
Well, when I'm actually just reading for enjoyment, no.
Interesting.
I just pick up straight from the beginning and give it a few chapters to see whether I can
Mhm.
stay on, But no, I won't specifically jump straight to dialogue.
Interesting. Yeah. But you have things like this. I don't think you really want to do that, he said. If you ask me, it's a terrible idea, Robert. No kidding, Jacob. I'm happy to try, but I think that it is a bit too difficult. I'm not feeling like I am capable of attempting something so hard.
Yeah, don't do that.
Everything is just so on the nose. There's no subtext. They're speaking stilted. You can tell it doesn't read natural. One of the biggest problems with uh, bland dialogue is it's not only boring to read, doesn't look good, but it can actually be confusing at times, because when you have people that speak so different than they would naturally speak, the audience could start to jump to weird conclusions as to what might be going on, because sometimes they try to read subtext that's not even there. Because usually when people are like really flowery or stilted, it means there's something really bad under the surface. So you don't want to give the audience that misunderstanding either. It may be natural for a robot. It's true. Yeah, if you're writing a fish out of water or somebody in a very awkward situation, yeah, I mean, they do tend to speak that way. But
Yeah, you'll often find on the nose dialogue. Oftentimes, pretty much the only place it tends to work is, well, not the only place, but for specific character use.
mhm,
And a lot of the time for comedy.
mhm.
For example, what's a good one? Grax in Guardians of the Galaxy. The way
Yes.
he speaks,
Mhm.
so
Right.
direct and on the nose,
Yes. Right.
when everyone else's dialogue is so
Right.
more natural or more dramatic, and then
Mhm.
he's just straight in there with the point, and often a wrong point, but
Yeah.
he's saying it so straight that it's hilarious.
Right. And I will say too, Drax, they ended up doing the writer device, hanging a lantern where you make it obvious to the audience, because he even really legitimately says, I don't understand metaphors. So like they spell it out to you that he's different, so that you can allow yourself to understand, oh yeah. Which maybe they didn't even need to go that far, but I mean they did, to tell the audience, yeah, we know this is weird, and he's he speaks in this affected way. Just go with us, and you'll have fun with it, and we can have this fun experience together. Here's another one that comes up. As you know, Sheila, he said, the only way into the prison is straight through the castle wall. Unfortunately, the gate is cast iron, and I'm much too weak to bash through it. Yes, Charles, it's all from that old mud wrestling injury you acquired back in high school when David clobbered you from behind. yeah, I mean, not only is the situation absurd, which is on purpose because I like writing absurd, but as you know, if you don't know, as you know, is a good sign that you're writing dialogue that is not needing to exist. Well, not needing to exist. It probably needs to exist for the audience to know, but there would be no reason for the characters to speak that to each other. Because generally speaking, you don't go into a room and it's like, well, as you know, I'm married and I have this many kids, and what, because they know. So why are you talking about it? So what happens, I think, with writers is they hear, oh, well, you don't want to do an information dump. And they're like, aha, I've got a secret. I'll just have them talk about it because people talk about things. But the problem is then you're still in an information dump. You have to be a lot more clever with this. And there are different tricks. Gareth, can you name a trick as to how to get around having people talk about things that they should already know? I'm curious. I know you've
Don't
mentioned one before.
don't have them do it. Is one.
Don't have them
It's
do
one of the
it.
tricks. No,
That is true.
this is part of it with the as you know. In a plan like this, for example, if they were discussing, somebody makes a suggestion and then the other character replies to them as like, there are 15 guards stationed there, and they're like, oh yeah, sorry. Again, that's wasted dead time. Don't just repeat information. The characters can query about it. What if this thing is still there? Possibly, so they reveal then that they know this, or they can remind the other character of it. But again, I'm not particularly happy with that either, because when it doesn't feel organic when they are speaking about information that they understand everybody already knows. That doesn't make any sense. That's simple exposition.
Right.
So find alternative ways to give that information, and if you can't give that information, well, then you use that information down the line. Show it.
I love the person. Bruce is getting into this high school castle wall, interesting world building. Well, of course, this came from my own weird imagination.
There's Daniel's forte.
My forte is non sequitur examples. But the thing is that there's a couple of ways you can get around this. I mean, one of the easy fixes, which is not recommendable all the time, but is to have a character that doesn't know so they can talk to them. That is a bad thing to fall onto, because then you're just info dumping to a random person or to another person, and that's still not very interesting to read. What tends to, I think, work a little bit better is if you want to either remind the audience of something or you want to get something out, is if a character makes a mistake and then the person has to remind them. I feel like that can work a little bit better, because they're like, he's like, oh, well, let's just go right through. And it's like, you idiot, what about this? That's not the end of the world. But to Gareth's point, what tends to work better is honestly is for people to talk about it as if they already know about it, but to give the audience enough context clues that they can piece it together themselves. And it's tricky, but it can be done. There are certainly examples where people have conversations, and you're just getting from the subtext and what they're talking about a lot of information that they're not explicitly saying. When somebody comes home and they start using affectionate terms to the other person, well, there's some sort of relationship, and if they start talking about an irritation at work, well, that tells them they have a job. It's not like, as you know, I am gainfully employed in whatever, you know what I mean? Like, you can get that information out by just having them talk about it, but in a way that they would talk about it because it's new information to each other. I don't know.
Yeah, there's a lot that can be said in the subtext, basically built in. That's one of the things that is really, I think, one of the strongest challenges when it comes to dialogue, and that is both in whether you're screenwriting or writing narrative fiction, is the problem of always trying to deal with subtext and always thinking about that side of things, where readers have a brain, they have a functioning brain, and they're able to fill in the blanks. And it's the filling in the blanks when you've given us enough, just enough to let us, use our own little putty to fill in the gaps, that makes it engaging.
Yes.
And it's in the kind of example that Daniel just said, is a couple of characters in only 3 lines of dialogue. You can have a lot set up there, where a character comes home from work walks into the door. The other person says, "Hey, babe," and okay, these two have a relationship.
Right.
The other one puts down his bags or whatever and huffs, and the other one just replies, "Another bad day," or "Bad day again." Two
Yep.
lines of dialogue. We know there's history there. They have a relationship, and it's not fun at his job. So
Right.
there's already a lot going into the scene. We don't need them to stop and have a big conversation, unload everything, and say, "Oh, hey, remember when we went on this trip?" and all this stuff. It's already baked in.
Yeah. Exactly. As you know, for the last 15 years, I've been sitting at this desk doing, yeah. Just again, though, but it's funny because as much as the as you know thing is known about, people use it all the time. And once you're aware of it, it just like hits you and you're like, oh, like, because you'll see professional works and things like that. And I'm not saying you can never use that phrase or something, but or something with that construction, but it's funny when you know it's a problem and you're like, oh, you just couldn't think of a better way. Well, okay, you're a little bit lazy, but I'll give you a pass. Of course, it's somebody that makes like billions of dollars, so like I don't have to give them a pass. How are you feeling today? Just wonderful. The kids are healthy. Job is going great. How about you? Could it be better? I feel like my boss recognizes my talents. Of course he does, because you are such a wonderful person. Well, you are a wonderful friend. Could it be any better? Like, not only is this stilted, but this does not seem like these people actually are telling the truth whatsoever. So, if this was a scene that was written in order to display us two people that pretty much hate each other's guts, or their lives are falling apart and they're putting on a brave face, would work pretty well. If you're trying to make this come across as genuine dialogue between two people who like each other, it's going to either make you look like somebody who doesn't write how normal people talk, or people are going to not really buy into that. They're going to just be like, oh, there's something going on because this is just so weird. Like people are not like this, and it'll really derail the thought you're trying to get across.
Yeah, something like that example. I think two people who have read a lot, or do read a lot, even watch a lot of movies, understand drama. If this is played straight, there's no conflict here. These
Yeah.
are two people getting along fully, so it's
Right.
less than interesting.
Right.
And if you were to read it in a book or read it in isolation, just like now, the only way your brain is automatically able to kind of make sense of that in a dramatic sense is if it's all sarcasm. And that's the thing. So you would start reading it and think, okay, these two hate each other, and this is one of these, through what they're saying, they're actually saying the opposite to each other.
Right. Yeah.
It's like,
Well,
you're a
I hope
wonderful
you have a
friend.
wonderful day.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's like, you're such a great parent to your kids. Things like that. That's what you kind of expect. But then if the story were to go on and you realize that, oh, wait, that was actually supposed to be honest.
Yeah.
It's just like, wait, what? That does not read naturally at all.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I've come across this with early writers, and I don't know what to do because I'm like, well, on the one hand, they're a new writer, so are they just not aware? But I'm like, well, maybe I'll give them the benefit of the doubt. Maybe these are people that are, and sometimes they are doing it right in terms of they are people that are like, as soon as the next scene starts, the guy's like, oh, I hate that guy, and you're like, oh, okay, I got what that scene was about. But it's dangerous even then to do this sort of thing. We had a workshop, a dialogue workshop just recently for our members, which is a great reason to become a member of AutoCrit if you are not. And one of the pieces of advice we heard was to have the characters disagree with each other. That is a very easy way to make your dialogue start to snap. Because to Garrett's point, there's really no drama in this scenario. It's just people building up each other and everything's going hunky dory great if you take it at face value. Um, if the drama is that beneath this, they really hate each other's guts, I would say you'd want some beats in there, or you would need it to be in the context that the audience would know before the conversation starts that they're about to have a conversation where they're lying through each other's teeth, because then the subtext is obviously a disagreement with each other, right? But to have a conversation that is just on the nose and everyone is just agreeing with each other, well, like, what's the point? Why are you even doing that? It's not interesting.
Yeah, why does this exist? One of the things to always keep in mind too is whenever any characters are interacting, the same as when any people are interacting in real life, the baseline is of not so much being friends, but of it's neutral ground. It's a
Hmm.
neutral baseline. Nobody's angry,
Hmm.
nor is anybody specifically over the top. And to paint either way, like for example, "Hey babe," when somebody walks into a room, you've used two words to describe the fact that this is not neutral ground. This is on the positive side of the relationship. You could use
Hmm.
a derogatory nickname in two
Right.
words. "Hey, Pinhead," or whatever they call the other
Right.
character, that this is a confrontational
Right.
relationship that they have.
Yep.
There's no need for just plain neutral conversations to show the two characters are neutral and know each other. That's wasted space.
Yep. Absolutely. Absolutely. All right. So those were some editor mistakes and how to avoid them. Well, not editor mistakes, mistakes that editors would catch, excuse me, and I'm going to edit myself on the fly, and how to avoid them. Because, if you can get through a lot of these points that we're talking about and deal with them head on, well, you'll put your work in much better place for an editor to come in and really do that nitty gritty development editing, character motivation, world building, plot holes, the stuff that you really want to use an editor for. Let's be frank, not so much these mechanical pieces as well.
Yeah, and I think one last tip on the dialogue front as well. I know, Daniel, you called out looking for the "as you know" kind of signifier of bad dialogue. To avoid on the nose dialogue, to have a look through your manuscripts at the lines people are saying and see if you find any that begin with "I feel" or "I
Mm.
something." I see it this way. I feel that's often signifiers of being really on the nose, and you can make it much more interesting by again rearranging it so they're kind of alluding to subtext. As much as you can work into subtext in dialogue, the more involving it'll be. It's really that simple. Well, I say that's simple as a rule. That's simple. It's not simple to do. Dialogue can be a real nightmare because you always got to think of it in that dramatic sense. You never just want to give straight information between the two because it's not delivering straight information at the end of the day between the two characters. You're delivering straight information to the reader, and oftentimes that's exposition.
Oh, somebody wants us to recap the list. Yes, I will. Our list was POV or tense shifting, repetition, inconsistent language, pacing problems, and bland dialogue. Those were the different things there. Well, we have to head out here in just a moment, but join us next week here at this time because next week we're going to talk about, let me get myself out of the way, query letter basics. So that should be fun and exciting, right, Gareth?
Yeah, when all this stuff's fixed, what are you going to do with it? You're going to
Yes, right?
query. So we'll go over what it takes to make a really great query letter that you can send out and have some confidence in.
Yeah.
I think based on what we've gone over today as well, as Daniel mentioned, if you are an AutoCrit Pro member, make sure to pop into our private community in Mighty Networks and check out the recording of our session with Rain Hall on dialogue. Lots and
Yes.
lots of great tips in there for you. If you're not a member, pop over to autocrit.com, sign up for an AutoCrit Pro membership, and you'll get access to the private network with all of our past guest recordings and upcoming events and all sorts. So make sure to give that a look.
Yes, absolutely. So many reasons to become an AutoCrit member. And we mentioned a lot of the reports that would help you out with a lot of these issues like pacing and repetition. And then, of course, we have our live events. But also for you on YouTube, please like, subscribe, comment, ring the bell, interact. It helps us with getting discovered, and that's going to open up more opportunities, and it will make sure you're notified if you ring that bell every time we do one of these live broadcasts, whether when we post new videos, so you can take advantage of all our fun knowledge that we share with you. So
Indeed.
all
Thank
right.
you all
So
for coming.
yep. See you next week for query letter basics.